And tonight, if you could pass out these um, and all the covenants that Adonai made with Israel, and remember, with Israel, will have their final fulfillment in the kingdom to come. When we've been talking about thy kingdom come, Yeshua taught us to pray, thy kingdom come. It's only one kingdom. The kingdom is not the church, Catholic or Protestant, evangelical, Baptist. That is not the kingdom. It is not Christianity or Judaism. The kingdom is not Christianity. It is not Judaism. And so it's important for us to understand that while Christianity, in its denominational, national forms, all the different Christianities there are, and all the different Judaisms that there are, many of them look at the kingdom as their own possession. But we're going to study within the next few months about what really is the kingdom. And the kingdom, in its just simplistic, as simple as possible, is the people of Elohim that follow him. The people of Elohim that follow him. That's it. Yes.
Well, in that case, I'm saying,
Yes.
in that case, a lot of Christians will go, I follow it, but that makes me the people of God. You know, can you specifically, so that we could answer, because if I tell some Christian that it's about, well, then I'm the kingdom of God.
Well, we're going to be looking at the parables of the kingdom, and the parables of, when we get into the concept of the parables of the kingdom, that will be answered, because the parables actually are the ones that make those differences. So when we get into that, that question will be answered. And remember, this is going to go on for several weeks, months. The way we do it here is we just study something until it's over. And when it's over, we start something new. And so we'll just study and, again, be able to see what Adonai does. But the kingdom is not the church. It's not Catholicism. It's not Protestantism. It's not the Christianities or the Judaisms. The kingdom is the people of Elohim that follow him. And basically, it started with our father Abraham. So let's start with Genesis 12:1. And while the kingdom would be promised, Genesis 12:1 is really the beginning promises of the kingdom. Now, here in 12:1, we have the concept that we would call Lech Lecha. This is the Parsha, begins with Lech Lecha. Now, Yahweh said to Avram, leave your country, your family, your father's house. So, the beginning of the kingdom concept is from Yahweh himself. He says to Abram, leave, lech lecha, arise, get up, leave, vete, ándale pronto y con buen modo. Arise, go, lech lecha. And he says, leave your country. Now, the country that he left was Ur of the Chaldees, the Chaldean kingdom. The Ur was the name of the city. Later on, the Chaldeans were to become the major group of that kingdom. Ur at this time of Abraham was just a smaller city. He says, leave your family, tu familia, just up and leave. Leave your father's house. Not only the wider family, but even the local family, leave. Now, the archaeological evidence of Ur and many of our soldiers that have served in the Gulf Wars actually served in the area of Ur of the Chaldees. We've had several people that marched through Ur in recent years in our armed forces in the Gulf Wars. This country was at that time, Ur of the Chaldees, Ur at the time of Abraham, was a very metropolitan city. It was Babel and all those cities around there, cities of that plain, of that Tigris, Euphrates river valleys, were some of the most influential economic centers of their time. And he says, leave for a land that I will show you. So there's three things here that Adonai tells Abram to leave to. He says, leave for a land that I will show you. He didn't even tell him where. It's like me telling one of you guys, I want you to go. Where? I'm not going to tell you, just go. What do you mean go? Pack up your bags and go. Go where? Just start walking, buy you a ticket. Where? Just go. And of course, from Ur, if you look at a map of Ur, of that whole area, there's only one place to go, and that's north. And he followed the river valley, and what we call the Fertile Crescent of the river valley, and into Canaan land, as we're going to see. Canaan land at the time was nowhere land. Canaan land at the time was the Wild West, in a sense. It's like in the 1800s, leaving New York City for Arizona, or one of those, Montana, or one of those, places where the natives were, up in arms for you coming there. That's the way Canaan was. The Canaanites were some of the roughest people of their time. And so Abraham is told to leave the comforts of home, the good plumbing of Ur of the time, modern plumbing of Ur, for, this nowhere place. To leave the familiar settings of your primos, leaving all your primos behind, leaving all your neighborhood behind, leaving even your father's house, leaving with your father, for a land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. Now think of it. Adonai tells this one man, leave everything, leave your family, leave your nation, your country, leave everything, and I will make of you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name so great it will be used as a blessing. So there's three things that Adonai promises to Abraham here: a land, a seed, and a blessing. Three things that are important for the kingdom of Elohim: a land, a seed, and a blessing. And this is why a religion like the Christianities, or a religion like the Judaisms, theological, philosophical religions, are not what the kingdom is. Because the kingdom is about a land, it's about a seed, and it's about a blessing. And there's three aspects of the land, seed, and blessing that we definitely need to see. The land, the seed, and the blessing are, number one, literal. We're not talking spiritual. We're not talking about a spiritual kingdom. Although the kingdom is spiritual, we're not talking about an allegory here, an illustration. We're not talking about a kingdom that is, like some kind of mystic kingdom. No, it's a literal kingdom. Now remember, Abraham knows about kings. I'm sure Abraham had heard of the famous kings of Babylon. I'm sure he had heard of Hammurabi and all these great kings of the ancient world, the kings of Egypt, because in those days, Egypt, the old kingdoms of Egypt and the old kingdoms of Babylon, and all these things were in the time of Abraham. So he knew what a kingdom was, but wait a second. He's just a regular guy. He's just a regular pagan. Abraham was a pagan. He was a part of the Gentile nations. He was a goy. He was part of the nation of Ur, the city-state of Ur. But I'm going to make of you a great nation. A nation's going to come out of you. And a nation means national kingship, boundaries. Lands have boundaries. So Adonai is going to give him a kingdom with boundaries, a nation with boundaries, a land that has boundaries, a nation, a seed. And a seed is also literal. It's not a spiritual seed. It's a literal seed, as we're going to see later on. And it's an eternal kingdom. It's not a kingdom temporarily. It's a kingdom that will be in this physical world, for thousands of years. And then when this physical world is over, this kingdom is going to be in a new heaven and a new earth forever and ever and ever. And Adonai wants to give to Abraham this land, this seed, and a blessing. And also the blessing is literal and it's eternal. And a third thing that the land, seed, and blessing are is unconditional. And that's the good part. They're unconditional. Conditional means if you do this, I will do this. Unconditional means that there's no conditions placed on you. Adonai, as we're going to see in chapter 15, Adonai gives them an unconditional promise. Now, these covenants that we will see later on, covenants of the kingdom, are promises to Abraham. That's why the promises in covenants, remember, they were first promises, but then the promises became covenants. So when someone promises you something, when somebody says, I promise that I'm going to give you $1,000, well, you take it on face value. It's not monopoly money. You know, it's not just $1,000 of, happiness. No, it's not something like that. It's just for a time. And there's no conditions. What if you slap me in the face? I'll still give it to you. So this land, seed, and blessing is literal, eternal, and unconditional. And the blessing part of it is, to us, part of the literal, part of the eternal, unconditional part that he says, and I will bless you and make your name so great, it will be used as a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. And all the mishpocha of the earth shall be blessed by you. So Abraham is going to be a blessing, and Abraham's choice of land, seed, and blessing is going to be a blessing for all the nations, not just for Israel. This is not something for one people, the sons of Abraham, the sons of Isaac, the sons of Jacob, the sons of Judah. It's not for one people. Think of it. From the beginning, from the call of Abraham, we have, you, Abraham, will be a blessing to all the mishpocha, all the families of the earth will be blessed by you. That means Adonai's choice of Abraham is for the nations through Abraham and his land and his seed. The seed of Abraham, the land that would be his, and the blessing is through this people for kol goyim, for all the nations of the world. Abraham was chosen for the nations. Sad to say, even up to our time, much of the chosen people have circled their wagons and said, we are the chosen people. Us, we. And it's for us, not for you. No, everything that was given to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, is for the nations. Because remember, every person in the whole world, Jew, Gentile, every person has the common problem. The common problem is death. Everybody's affected by death. And death is because of sin. The solution to the sin problem is what the covenants, what the whole scriptures are all about. And the solution to the sin problem comes through a land, through a seed, and through the blessing. And I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. And all the mishpocha will be blessed by you. Now, if you go down to verse 6, Abraham passed through the land as far as Shechem's holy place, the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Yahweh appeared to Abraham and said, "It is to your seed. It is to your seed that I will give this land." So the land belongs to the seed of Abraham. If we go to Galatians chapter 3, go to Galatians chapter 3. In verse 8 there, it talks about this idea that the gospel is preached and the gospel was revealed to Abraham and to his seed. And notice that Paul says there, notice that it says, and to his seed, singular, not plural. And that seed is who? Messiah. It says there, Messiah. And so the gospel that was preached by Paul is based on Torah here in Galatians. And here in Galatians, we see that this idea of the seed in Galatians 3:8 and Galatians 3:16 are very, very important here in Genesis chapter 12 about Abraham, the land, the seed, and the blessing. And that blessing is who? Mashiach, Messiah. The seed is Messiah. The seed is Messiah. Notice that it says it's not plural, it's singular. It's not as if he had many descendants, which he does. In fact, another place he says, your descendants are going to be like the stars, like the sand of the sea. But over here, he's focusing on, it is to your seed, singular, that I give this land. And so the land, the seed, and the blessing are the first promises. The first promises, not even in covenant form. There's no covenant given. There's not anything that has to do with sign on the dotted line here. Adonai just appears to him, to this Gentile, and says, leave. Now, we don't know Abraham's life before Adonai appeared to him. The Talmud has all kinds of stories. You've probably all heard the story of him breaking all the idols. That's a Talmudic fairy tale. It never happened. But we don't know what happened in reality. We only know what Scripture says. But Adonai must have seen something in this man. And Adonai is always looking for someone to talk to. Adonai is always looking for someone. But Adonai must have seen something in this man that not only would he be the father of a nation, but he would be the father of many nations. Many nations. And so, because whether you're Jew or Gentile, rich or poor, male or female, slave or free, if you've been baptized into Messiah, you are B'nai Avraham, and you are an inheritor to this promise. That's why I constantly keep saying, while Adonai has responsibilities for the Jew, Adonai has responsibilities for the Jew, for the Israelite, for the Hebrew. If you consider, and I'll always say, if you consider yourself a Gentile, because so many people that have considered themselves Gentiles have turned up that, hey, wait a second, I'm a Jew. You know, not only have you said, I'm a Jew, but all of a sudden you found out, it says, wait a second, I'm a Cohen. I'm a Levite. You know, have this percentage. In fact, Robert just found out that, you know, he's not Sephardic. Can you imagine? He's not Sephardic. You know what he is? Ashkenazi. His DNA shows he's Ashkenazi. And many of you have found out you're Ashkenazi. Many of you have found out you're Sephardic, just from doing a DNA test. And one of the things, in fact, he has more percentage than I do. Look at that, Robert. And so it's interesting that those that have considered themselves, I'm just a Gentile, all of a sudden, through genealogy, through DNA, you have a percentage of being Jewish or Hebrew. By the way, even most of the Jews that have done their DNA, mostly everybody has low percentages. I haven't seen anybody with too many people with very high, definitely nobody has 100%. I've never seen anybody with 100% in anything rather than, unless they're like European, which is a general, made up of many, many peoples. But whether you consider yourself a Gentile just by the fact that you've now found out, you know what? I have Jewish blood. But whether you don't find that and you still consider yourself, or you're 100% Gentile in a sense, and there's no Jew, you are still a child of Abraham. You are still Israel. You're still Israel, and you are still B'nai Avraham. We must establish that fact. Every Messianic congregation must establish that fact. That is one of the key points that we want to do as Messianics. As Messianics, one of the things that we don't want to do is make it a cultural Judaism, or a cultural Messianic fellowship, a cultural, because it's not culture, it's Torah. It's not even Sephardic culture. You know, it's Sephardic and Ashkenazi cultures. This has to do with how they pronounce words, who's more lively or who's more stern, or you know, do you say Shabbat or Shabbos? You know, has nothing to do with it. And do you wear all black and a fur hat, or do you wear, you know, more lively clothes? It doesn't. Stuff like that doesn't matter. What matters is that we're B'nai Avraham, because All the nations, all the mishpocha, including Israel, is blessed by Abraham. Every male or female believer is blessed by Abraham. Every slave or free, every rich or poor. Our blessing is in Abraham, and our inheritance is in Abraham. Let's go to chapter 13, verse 15. Chapter 13, verse 15 of Genesis, correct. Genesis 15. 15. 13, 15. Capítulo 13, versículo 15. All the land within sight. All the land what? Within sight. I will give to you and your seed forever. Land. All the land within sight. That means when he came to Canaan land and stood on top of the hill, he says, look around. All this land is yours. All this land belongs to you and your seed. Remember, in Galatians it says what? Seed plural, is singular, not plural. Seed singular, not plural. But watch what it says. I will give to your seed forever. How long? Forever. And how long is forever? Forever. That means that Abraham's seed owns the land. Abraham's seed owns the land. And Abraham's seed singular owns the land. Not Abraham's seed plural owns the land. In fact, you know what? The Jews don't own Israel. Adonai owns Israel. The United Nations does not own Israel. Adonai owns Israel. America does not own Israel. Even Israel doesn't know. The Knesset don't own Israel. Adonai owns Israel. And not only does Adonai own it, but the seed of Abraham, singular, which is Messiah, owns Israel. Think of it. Yeshua owns Israel. When you go to Israel, when you go and walk that land, always remember, this is Messiah's land. This is Yeshua's land. This is nobody's land except Yeshua. Yeshua is the owner. Yeshua is the owner. Nobody owns that land. Yeshua is the owner. So here we see that it's literal. The land within sight. We see that it's eternal, forever. Let's go to 13 and already talked about eternal. Let's go to 15:9. And here in 15:9, let's start with verse 7. I am Yahweh, he said to him, who brought you out of the land of Ur of the Chaldeans, to make you heir of this land. Adonai Yahweh. Abram replied, how am I to know that I am to inherit it? Okay, so I give this to you and your seed forever. How am I to know that I'm going to inherit this land? Now remember, the land is the inheritance, primary inheritance of Abraham, the land. And like what Galatians says, those who are baptized into Messiah are heirs of Abraham. So if those of you that are baptized into Messiah, not only does that land belong to Abraham and Messiah, but it belongs to you. In fact, it belongs to you as Jews and Gentiles here more than it belongs to unbelieving Jews that are even living in the land today. The rabbis that live in the land, they live there, but the land doesn't belong to them. It belongs to Abraham and his seed, Messiah, according to Galatians. And it belongs to you because you are the seed of Abraham. You are the heirs according to his promise. Galatians 3, the whole of it just is so important. Let's see who had a hand up. Yes.
I'm sorry, on verse 7, Abraham said, to give you a blessing, so he said, Abraham, oh Lord God.
Mm-hmm.
Well, is that
Yod He Vav He? Yes. Now, this is what's interesting, and this is why I believe that Yehovah or Jehovah is not the correct pronunciation, because the Leningrad Codex and the Aleppo Codex, which are the main codices of how to pronounce Hebrew, and the Jewish and Christian Bibles have to use gymnastics, word gymnastics, to come up with this. Now, in the Hebrew, this verse says, Adoni Yahweh. Adoni Yahweh. Well, when it says Adoni, Adon, it's translated in English most of the time as my Lord or Lord in small letters. When it says Yahweh, then it's translated Lord in capital letters. Here is one of those places when if you do what the rabbis tell you to do, then it'll say, my Lord, Lord, which is redundant, because that's not what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew says, Adoni Yahweh, my sovereign Yahweh. Adoni is sovereign or master. Translated as Lord in English, the English got it from the landlords. Anybody of you here a landlord? You rent houses? If you're a landlord, you're a lord. Well, that's a common word. But Adoni, and in Spanish, the Sephardic word is Don. Don Juan, Don Francisco. It doesn't, Don is not Don, that's not their first name. His name isn't Don Francisco. Don comes from the word Adon, and Adon is a landowner. Here in New Mexico, anybody that was called Don meant that they owned land. They owned land. That's Adon. Those dones were the landowners. And that's where that comes from. And it means a master, a sovereign. And so over here, it says, my sovereign, but it says, Yod He Vav He. But you can use Lord, Lord, or Adoni, 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 Adonai. So what the rabbis did on this one, so you won't pronounce Yod He Vav He, and that's why in some of your Bibles, Lord is in small letters and God is in big letters. Is those God in big letters? The God big letters in your English Bibles means that what they did, instead of using Lord in big letters for Yod He Vav He, they use God in big letters for Yod He Vav He, because the rabbis put there not Yehovah, but they put Yehovi. Yehovi is every time you have this combination, they will use Yehovi, so that instead of saying Adonai, you say God, because the Yehovah, comes from Elohim. If it's Yehovah, it's Adonai. But if it's Yehovah, it's Elohim. So I hope I confused you, because that's what the rabbis have done. The rabbis have actually thrown this monkey wrench into it so everybody could be confused. And it wasn't so much the rabbis that confused the Christians, because the rabbis, who were the only ones that read scripture at the time, they were able to, every time they come here, instead of saying Adonai Yahweh, they would say Adonai Elohim. So they knew the score. They knew the protocol. But like I said, Father Martini, who was a Spanish cleric, when he translated over here, he's the one that actually got unknowingly, not knowing the rabbinic protocol. What Martini did is he actually transliterated the Hebrew Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh with the vowels of Adonai, and he came up with Yehovah. So Yehovah was a mistake that Martini, I think his name was Alberto Martini, and he's the one that made the mistake in the Latin translation. So once it got into Latin, then it got into English, and of course at that time the J symbol is an actual I symbol. The J is an I, but it's a stylized I. You know, like in some of the early manuscripts, they like to stylize. So when an I began a word, it was not just a regular I, it was stylized I, and it became what we call a J. And later on, the J's were all, in fact, in the original word Yugoslavia. If you go to Yugoslavia, it's not pronounced with a Y, it's pronounced with a J, but it's pronounced Yugoslavia. It's not pronounced, if you pronounce it Yugoslavia, people look at you because it's Yugoslavia, but it's spelled with a J, because the J is a I. And the Greek and some of those Latins don't have the Y symbol, so they use the I, stylized. And then later on, people started using je instead of I, and it became Jehovah instead of Yehovah. And so that's what that is right there. Okay. How will I know that I am to inherit? Well, again, he's thinking literally. He's not thinking of a spiritual kingdom, a spiritual land, a spiritual seed. How am I to know? And Adonai tells him, get a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. He brought him all these, cut them in half, and put half on one side and half on the other. But the birds he did not cut in half. Birds of prey came down to the carcasses, but Abraham shooed them away. Now, this is how covenants were done in the ancient world. In the ancient world, when you made a contract, you didn't have 2 pieces of paper and people signed on the dotted line. You didn't do that. You actually got animals, and the more animals you got, that means the more heavy the contract was. And you cut the animals in half, and you walked in the middle. Well, what happens when you cut animals in half and you walk in the middle? Well, the gooey stuff gets on your sandals, gets on your feet. And in a sense, what you're saying is, may this happen to me and more if I break the contract. So Abraham is told by Adonai, get all the fixings for a covenant. And he gets all the fixings for a covenant. And now they're about to make a covenant. In verse 12, it says, now as the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and fear seized him. Then Yahweh said this to Abraham. Now remember, Abraham is asleep. All of a sudden, he's afraid because Adonai comes and approaches him. And he is so afraid that he just falls into a sleep. But while Abraham is asleep, Adonai is talking to him. This is what makes it unconditional. If he was awake and Abraham walked through that, then he'd be conditional. But Abraham was asleep. And then Adonai says, know this for certain, your descendants will be exiled in a land not their own, where they will be slaves and oppressed for 400 years. That's the Egyptian captivity. But I will pass judgment on the nation that enslaves them, and they will leave with many possessions. That got fulfilled exactly. For your part, you shall go to your fathers in shalom. You shall be buried at a ripe old age. In the 4th generation they will come back, for the wickedness of the Amorites is not ended. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, there appeared a smoking furnace. This is the kavod of Adonai. This is the kavod of Adonai. The kavod, remember with Abraham later on, comes as a pillar of fire. Here is the smoking furnace. And a firebrand that went through the halves. That day, Yahweh made a covenant with Abraham in these terms. And so what's interesting is not only that a pillar of fire or a furnace come, but a chispa, a firebrand. Now, where does a chispa come from? A spark. Where does it come? From the fire. So here we have the fire, the Father, the chispa, the Messiah. Now think of this. It takes two to make a covenant. You don't make a covenant with yourself. You make a covenant with someone else. When you buy a house, you buy a car. Anytime you make an agreement, you sign it, and party of the first part says that I will do this. If party in the second part does this, and party of the first part, but if party of the second part doesn't do this, then party of the first part will, standard, contract form. Marriage, anything, it's always two. Even Willy Wonka makes covenants like that, right? How many of you know about Willy Wonka's covenants? You sign on the dotted line, right? You seen Willy Wonka? I forgot what I was going to say. Oh, yeah, the chocolate factory guy. So it takes two to make a covenant, and two make a covenant. Yahweh makes a covenant, and the firebrand stands in for Abraham. So the firebrand signs on the dotted line for the sleeping Abraham. So the covenant is unconditional to Abraham, but is conditional on the Father and on Messiah. They're the ones, the father and the seed of Abraham are responsible to keep the covenant with these terms. Yes, sir.
So my Bible says a smoking furnace and a burning lamp.
Yeah.
And you're saying the smoking furnace represents Yahweh and the burning lamp
Burning lamp.
represents
Correct. And I always use this as an example. This is a replica. In every home, this has leather, and by the door, this pot is a smoking furnace. And this is the pilot light in every house in the ancient world. And it was hung right by the front door so that it could get air fresh, but in case it got too much fire, you could throw it outside real fast. But what is in here is embers. And embers are always kept in here. And when a son is born, or when a son gets married, the father gets one of these pots for the son. And he gets some of the embers and puts it in the son's and starts his fire. Now, you cannot start a fire after Moshe on the Shabbat. But you can transfer fire. So this is the pilot light. You could start any light with this, but you can't start one of this. So you get an ember from here, and you put it in the sun, and you start his pot. And you keep it going all the time. You're throwing, so this is always on. When the son grows up and he has kids, he gets some of that embers and throws it on. Some of these pots go on for generations burning, generations upon generations, one fire through 100, 200, 300 years, never going out, always being passed from one and the other. So a firebrand, a furnace passes, this is the Father. This is a symbol of the Father. But a torch, a firebrand, a chispa, an ember, from here, from the Father to the Son, now passes, and that is the symbol of Messiah. Can you imagine that? Just using ordinary things from archaeology that we've found that show what is over here. How Abraham did the covenant, how Adonai passed through it. That's why it's not only literal, not only eternal, but it is unconditional. The land, the seed, and the blessing are literal, unconditional, and eternal from Adonai. Well, let's go ahead and stop here, and we will continue with number 2. We have 7 to go. And by the way, this is just I was supposed to go through all 7 tonight as introductions, but let's stop here. Any questions that anybody has?
Literal, what, and unconditional?
Literal, eternal, and unconditional.
So the way I'm looking at it is Abraham, that's the land, Israel, the seed, Messiah,
Mm-hmm.
the promise is the blessing. So when we accept Messiah as our Lord and Savior, we born again, we have inherited the land, the seed, and the blessing.
And the blessing. The blessing is salvation, because that's what Galatians 3 says there. Galatians 3:8, I believe it was, right? Galatians 3:8. 3:8 and 16, yeah. Yeah, exactly, yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so it seems from this that in chronological sense, the seed is a descendant of Abraham, but yet Abraham was made great from his seed, so it goes backwards and forward.
Exactly, yeah. I like that, yeah. Good, good. Good. Galatians 8 and 16. Chapter 3, verses 8 and 16. Yeah. Well, the whole of Galatians, read. Go ahead.
Yo por lo que veo todos los pactos están sellados con sangre,
Sí.
todos y cada uno. En el caso que estamos hablando ahorita, se hace el pacto con las becerras, con las aves y todo. Ahí está la sangre,
Ujú.
la firma de Abraham, que es la carne que está poniendo,
Sí.
y la fuego.
Sí,
Cuando-
sí.
Pero todos los pactos llevan sangre. ¿No?
Yeah. He said all the covenants are blood covenants. There is no covenant that Adonai made with Israel. By the way, it's important also to say Adonai never made any covenant with the Gentiles. The only covenant outside of Israel that Adonai did was with Noah. With Noah. But that's before there was Gentiles. Remember, from Adam to the Tower of Babel, there was only one people. And they were what we call Edenic people. They were people that came out of Eden. When Adam and Eve were kicked out of Eden and they lived in that area, their language was Edenic, the language of Eden. They were from Eden. Just like, if you're from this land and you move to China, they'll say you're an American because you came out of here. Si eres mexicano, vienes de Mexico. Well, these guys were Edenic people because they came out of Eden. They spoke Edenic language. But at the Tower of Babel, Adonai separated them into nations, 70 nations. At the Tower of Babel is the beginning of the Gentile nations. And there, in Genesis 10 and 11, you see what we call the Table of Nations. And if you count them, there are 70 nations. So there was 70 tribal groups, 70 languages that came out of Babel. And Abram was just one from one of those nations. So he was a national. The Tower of Babel is the beginning of the nations. From then on, Adonai is going to work with nations until the time of the Gentiles is over, time of the nations. Because remember, people don't use the term Gentile correctly today. A Gentile is a nation. The Gentiles are the nations, the Goyim, Goy and Goyim. And so one of the things that we know is that Abraham came out of the nations, and the nations started doing covenants. And it's interesting because Noah, the father of Larry, Moe, and Curly, who they became the fathers of the 70 nations, Noah made a covenant, blood covenant, Adonai, and he sacrificed of the clean animals, it says. Right. So his 3 sons, my 3 sons, knew about blood covenants from Noah. And that's why the nations started doing blood covenants. Except that the nations, because they weren't under direct inspiration of Elohim, started doing their own thing and even sacrificing their own kids. And so we have the 3 sons, the good, Shem, the bad, Ham, and the ugly, Japheth. So that's so yeah, it's always a blood covenant, and all the covenants are with Israel, and always with the blood of a lamb, goat, heifer, clean animal. A salt covenant is the same thing, but the term salt is what preserves. So when you do a salt covenant, in fact, in those days, they wouldn't even eat with salt with someone. Once you pour salt on your food and you're eating with someone and making a meal covenant and a salt covenant with salt, that means enduring. That means you are friends forever. And you can't break that friendship. You can't break that covenant. So.
So,
Yeah, in fact, what's interesting is, now I believe this. One of the questions has always been, where is the Garden of Eden? And while people look at it in the Persian Gulf, and that if you look at maps of the Persian Gulfs of even south of Ur of the Chaldees, it'll say traditional Garden of Eden. But we believe that the Garden of Eden was actually Jerusalem, the land of Israel. And because the post-flood geography changed. Remember, the geography before the flood was different than the geography after the flood. And after the flood, they came down to the land of Shinar, which is the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, which is Ur of the Chaldees, which is where Abraham was. But Adonai wanted to send Abraham from the place of where he was, metropolitan center, to where the garden was, to where the place was. And so the Canaanites, and this is very Chasatani or Chasatanish, that he always likes to destroy what Adonai has. Chasatan, knowing where the Garden of Eden was, brought the worst people to that place, even the Temple Mount, even all those places, Aruna's Temple Mount, all these Jebusites, all these different Canaanite groups with murder, with child sacrifice, and all this, polluted the land. So what does Adonai always like to do? Redeem the land. So he calls Abraham back to where it all started from. And where it all started from is where it's all going to end at. Sacrifice Isaac, right at that same place. And what's interesting is Golgotha. Now remember, Golgotha means the place of the skull. Golgotha is not a Christian. Golgotha is not a Christian name. It's an Aramaic name from before the time of Yeshua. That hill was called Golgotha. Not because it looked like a skull. By the way, the skull hill in the English garden tomb are not the real. It's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where the Catholics have. That's the real Golgotha, and you could even actually touch that Golgotha hill today. And that was called Golgotha because the tradition was, before the time of Yeshua, that's where Adam was buried. That's where Adam was buried. It is Adam's skull. And I don't know if you've seen pictures of the cross, and usually old Latin pictures of the cross with Yeshua on the cross. If you look at the bottom, there's always a skull. If you look at the old pictures, old Catholic pictures of the crucifixion, you'll always see a skull. And that's Adam's skull. It's not that it looked like a skull, the hill. It's because it was believed in intertestamental period that that's where Adam was buried. Now think of this. If Adam was buried there, then it's outside even the walls of Jerusalem at the time. It was outside the walls. And if the Garden of Eden is the Temple Mount, then Adam actually died outside the camp. Outside the camp. What camp? Eden. And the Temple Mount, the rock, is where Eden was. And the Gihon and all those are just reminders, just ancient reminders of a pre-flood geography. Because remember, when New England was named after England, New Hampshire was named after Hampshire. New Mexico was not named after Mexico. Did you guys know that? That New Mexico was not named after Mexico? New Mexico was named New Mexico in 1592. Mexico was only named Mexico in 1820. So there was no Mexico till 1820, but New Mexico was named New Mexico in 1592. Because we were not named after Mexico, we were named after a valley where there was a lot of gold, Mexique, and the Mexica people that lived there. Well, that's another story. That's history.
How did they get new? Where was it new?
Because when the conquistadores came over here,
The New World.
they came to the city of Zuni, the pueblo of Zuni Pueblo, and as they looked at the city of the pueblo of Zuni, they saw it with brilliance, and they said, you know what? Their houses are made of gold. So instead of going to Zuni, they went back to Mexico, what is now Mexico, La Ciudad, and they told the viceroy over there, you know what? The houses are made of gold. And because where the Mexica people lived, that's where they were getting the Aztecs were getting the gold. They said, este va a ser un nuevo México. This is going to be a new Mexico after the gold, el Valle de Mexico, where the gold was. So Mexico was just a valley where there was a lot of gold rather than a city. It was Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan was the name of la capital. Tenochtitlan. Yeah. In Nahuas? Nahuatl. Yeah. This guy's from Mexico City, so he knows this story better than me. But I still can't figure out why he doesn't talk like the Mexico City people. ¿Por qué no hablas como ellos? ¿Y ustedes de México también? ¿El mismo lugar? So these guys are real Mexicans. Yeah. In fact, real Mexicans are just from el Estado de Mexico. Originally, right? Correct? Solo ellos son los de Zacatecas, no son de México. They're from Monterrey. No son mexicanos. Piensan que son mexicanos. Quieren ser mexicanos, pero no son mexicanos, ¿verdad? Let's go ahead and stand before the people listening to us on video. Start saying, what's this guy talking about? Father, we thank you for the opportunity that we have to be here tonight. We pray that your Ruach HaKodesh, your Holy Spirit, could allow us, even now, to go home and see if these things be so, that we could get into our scriptures. In Yeshua's name, amen. Shalom, shalom. There's a